Yes, yes.
Okay, that's
Either
good.
on Facebook, on the Facebook page of ODIR, ODIR, or directly on the website. There should be a window
I
where you can
see.
actually play it.
Okay, that's good
Play
to
it.
know. Just in case I miss something.
Yeah, 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 sure.
At the end, yes, something to play. We're trying to remind.
I have the briefing book in case there's any tough questions. Yeah, you can help with anything.
Okay, thanks.
Phones turned off.
Just who will tell us when we're
I'll check.
maybe we'll ask Donna to come. Oh, okay, but we have to know where we are online.
We're probably streaming right now. Probably
Yes, I
check.
think we are streaming.
But it's on our website, it's on Facebook.
Yeah, it's on both. It's on both. So,
Online.
yeah, we're online. Gigi,
Hmm?
we're on.
Yeah.
It's streaming.
Good, so we have this preparatory stage here.
Do you want? Come on. Oh. No. Oh, okay.
Just wait for them.
Yes. So we're just waiting for one more speaker. We'll be beginning momentarily. Marks. Make some changes.
Well, we are raising more interest. We're expecting some surprise. Sure. Okay.
So is there a single journalist here?
These are journals. Georgian media.
Yeah, he brings his own video with him.
You can
So,
ask ask me that.
I mentioned. So I believe we're about ready to start now. We have everyone here, it looks like. So yeah, welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nat Perry. I'm head of communications at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and this is the press conference for the International Election Observation Mission to the midterm elections that took place here in the United States yesterday. So this mission has been a joint endeavor of two OSCE institutions working together. We have the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, as well as the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, both of which are represented here. So we'll hear from each of them, and then we'll have some time for questions, so please keep that in mind. We'll first hear from Mr. George Serratelli, who's been appointed as the Special Coordinator of the OSCE Short-Term Observer Mission. Then we'll hear remarks from Isabel Santos, who has led the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly delegation. And finally from Tana de Zulueta, who has led the limited election observation mission of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. So with that, let's begin. Mr. Serratelli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nat. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this press conference. Our main conclusions were that yesterday's midterm elections were highly competitive, and contestants could campaign freely, with media presenting a wide array of information and views, enabling voters to make an informed choice. However, campaign rhetoric was often intensely negative and at times sometimes intolerant, including on social networks. The fundamental rights of suffrage was undercut in places by disenfranchisement of some groups of citizens and lack of full representation in Congress. Campaign finance rules do not guarantee full transparency. While the elections were largely administered in a professional manner and voters turned out in high numbers, decisions on important aspects of the electoral process were often politicized. It's clear for all to see that the campaign engaged a high number of voters across all the country. Personally, I was really deeply impressed to see the commitment of voters here in the capital, in Washington, the people lined up in the pouring rain, diligently waiting their turn to cast their vote, and we really salute your commitment. Our teams were well received in polling stations in several states across the country yesterday. We found the election officials to be competent, working transparently and generally welcoming of both our observers and voters. While we clearly say that the elections were professionally run and the administration benefits from broad trust, chief election officials of some states were candidates in these elections, in the same elections they supervised. This can potentially lead to conflicts of interest and inevitably raises questions about the independence of the administration. This should be addressed. A number of states enhanced their efforts to facilitate voter registration, including online and automatic registration. Efforts were also made to enhance integrity of voter registers through increased sharing of state registration databases. Nonetheless, it is estimated that some 50 million eligible citizens were not registered to these elections for various reasons. They were the most expensive midterm elections in the United States, with campaigning projected to have cost some $5.2 billion. The campaign finances and finance rules that are in place, which are quite permissive and do not include limits on spending, and they really undercut, and it's undercut by the existence of non-profit organizations that are not required to disclose their reports. This undermines the intended transparency of the system. I'm happy that we had a very strong team here in the United States for these elections, and are pleased to be able to report our conclusions today. Before handing over the word to my colleagues, I would recap by saying that yesterday the American people once again demonstrated their commitment to democratic elections in a hard-fought and vibrant campaign that clearly engaged voters and had millions eagerly waiting results last night. While the rhetoric we heard from the campaign trail was often divisive, Americans came together to vote in professionally run elections, and I hope that newly elected Congress, which is really very important, will find the political will to overcome the challenges we have defined and identified. So thank you very much, and I pass the floor to my colleague Isabel Santos, and of course look forward to answer your questions if you may have.
Thank you, George Scaratelli. I have led the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's delegation of nearly 70 parliamentarians for the election observation mission. It is the 7th time we have been in this country to observe an election. We were deployed yesterday in California, Virginia, Maryland, Maine, Georgia, Missouri, New York, and in the District of Columbia. Our observers noted that these were well-run elections, but the diverse nature of the American system means that there isn't a single picture. We welcome progress in some states to facilitate voter registration and to reinstate voting rights to citizens. But we cannot ignore the fact that millions of Americans remain effectively disenfranchised. Much more attention and investment in democracy remains critical if the United States is to overcome these long-standing challenges and address new ones like effectively securing election infrastructure. Also, we have observed some difficulties. That there are in such an active participation of citizens and civil society in this country means that many of these issues are largely addressed, effectively dealt with in order to ensure an inclusive democracy. We welcome efforts to reform the congressional districting process. And with the census coming up in 2 years, we hope that the United States continues to tackle this issue. Voter identification is a politically divisive issue. In these elections, 34 states required voters to show identification, 17 of which required photo identification. Voter ID rules can present obstacles, particularly for low-income voters, racial and linguistic minorities, and Native Americans. The way redistricting is done in many places can lead to undue partisan advantage and may have resulted in a number of uncompetitive contests. Districting should be done in a way that is fair, inclusive, representative, and non-partisan. Similarly, we have noted that steps have been taken to address the issue of disenfranchisement, particularly as related to the voting rights of convicted felons. While these are welcome steps, more must be done to ensure that the principle of universal suffrage is upheld in line with the international commitments to which the United States has agreed. Social media has emerged as a key tool in political campaigns and source of information for voters. While this tool has enormous potential and real benefits, including by enabling candidates to communicate directly with voters at a very low cost, the risks of misuse are clear and should be addressed comprehensively. We have seen highly polarized rhetoric play out on social media, and of course we are all aware of the threat of foreign interference and as well as challenges posed by fake news. Greater responsibility is needed to ensure that social media is a force for good and not bad in democratic processes. International observation is limited in practice by restrictions and limitations imposed by some states. We have largely been welcome where we have deployed this year, but I should point out that we have limited this deployment based on legal restrictions in some states. We hope that states across the country will review their policies and practices in regard to international observation. It is in the interest of democracy to ensure an open and transparent process, which is enhanced greatly by international election observation. Finally, I would like to thank election officials, voters, and election stakeholders who have met with us and made this election observation mission so successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Santos. And finally, we will hear from Ms. Tana de Zulueta of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is for me a pleasure to join my colleagues from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in delivering this joint statement. I'm honoured to head the long-term observation of ODIHR, which has been working in the United States since the 3rd of October, with long-term observers deployed in 47 of the states. I would also like to extend my thanks to our hosts, the US authorities, for inviting us, and to the State Department, and also to the National Association of Secretaries of State and the National Association of State Election Directors for their assistance as well, naturally, as our appreciation for all the other federal and state institutions, the political parties, the candidates, the media representatives, and civil organizations who took time while we were in the country to meet with us and help us in our work. I will not repeat the shared conclusions offered by my colleagues. I would just like to remember an unhappy memory from this past long over a month that we spent in the country, which were the security-related incidents that cast a shadow over this campaign, and in particular the tragic events which occurred on the 27th of October in Pittsburgh and the loss of life that followed. I'd like to point out that the ODIHR Director and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly condemned the attack in Pittsburgh and called on political leaders of all sides to speak out against anti-Semitism and all forms of intolerance and discrimination. Returning to our findings, we look, naturally, when we assess an election, we look at the legal framework. And that's been quite a challenge in this highly decentralized process. But I would like to point to one of our findings and past recommendation regarding the legal framework. And that is the continued non-implementation of key aspects of the landmark Voting Rights Act. The lack of agreement in Congress to adopt a new formula to determine which states and jurisdictions should be required to pre-clear changes to electoral law removes what we consider long-standing, timely and effective safeguard against discrimination on racial and linguistic grounds. It is important that Congress finds a way to update this formula so as to give effect to this important law. Second, I'd like to mention the media. We have been extensively monitoring the coverage of the campaign on a range of national media. We were able to do this systematically during our stay in the country. Our findings underscore that the broad range of professional and active media sources available to voters is one of the strengths of the American political system. However, and I speak as a former journalist myself, it has been troubling to see journalists being threatened, singled out, and their credibility questioned, as we have during this campaign. This quite simply undermines what we consider an essential role of the media in a democratic society, which is that to be able to give all voters a balanced picture of events and of the political proposals being made. Fourth, cybersecurity and voting technologies. This mission, and was for us a novelty, included a new voting technologies analyst. And it was a very interesting part of our observation. We were pleased to see federal and state authorities launch a number of robust initiatives to help secure election technologies, including from cyber threats. The Election Assistance Commission expeditiously dispersed $380 million that Congress allocated to replace outdated voting machines and strengthen existing computer and network infrastructure and build cybersecurity capacity. There were no public reports in this election of verified cyber attacks on election infrastructure, to our knowledge. However, challenges remain in respect of coordination among the federal and state bodies on security of voter registration web pages in particular, and requirements for vendors to upgrade their systems. These are not standardized. It is clear that more investment, as my colleague mentioned, is needed, both in terms of continual updating of equipment and software, as well as to the institutions that support this work. Notably, to the Election Assistance Commission, that continues to provide valuable and appreciated support to election officials, despite the lack of commissioners. And we have to note that there is even a standing bill in Congress to disband this commission. With that, let me close by saying that our observers will remain in the country for another week, and we will continue to follow the electoral process, including the finalization of the counting and tabulation and consideration of complaints and appeals. After some time, we will issue a final report, and like in the past, we will give more detailed findings and recommendations to support the United States in efforts to continuously improve electoral law and practice in line with OSCE commitments and other international standards for democratic elections to which the United States is party. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. De Zulueta, and thank you to all of our panelists. We now have some time for questions from journalists. So if there are any questions, please identify yourself and the outlet that you represent, and we'd be happy to take your questions. We have some microphones, I believe, at the back of the room right here. So, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tim Johnson. I work with McClatchy, a newspaper chain. I would like to ask you, there was some criticism of secretaries of state who manage elections running for office at the same time. There were 3 cases yesterday, 2 cases of secretaries of state running for governor and 1 case of a secretary of state running for lieutenant governor. But there are many secretaries of state who are simply running for re-election. Can you spell out exactly what your opposition to this practice is and whether it meets international standards or violates treaties or whatever?
Thank you for that question. Is there Mr. Staratelli?
Sure. Thank you for this question. I think we already pointed out that such a practices when people administering elections and oversighting or supervising the process, at the same time they are also taking part in this play, in this game, and in this process, let's say, which elections are. So it always could cause and it could raise concerns about the conflict of interest, independence, and I think that that should be prevented. How it should be prevented? There could be also the recommendations from our side, and what Ms. Zuleta said, and what is also our desire, and what's also in our recommendation. We will work with authorities in this country as we're working also with some other countries. It's very clear that such cases should be prevented, as I told you.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add? No? We're good. Okay. If there are any other questions, we have some more time. If not, yes, please. Hold on one sec. Oh.
My name is David Nicholas. I represent Georgian television station Rusa between Washington, D.C. I was wondering if you would give us some more details about media. Do you have special recommendations about media coverage to the administration of the United States? Thank you very much.
We have yet to formulate our recommendations on this field. We have past recommendations. But the issue which I mentioned is not one which has in the past, which we have mentioned before, the fact that journalists were singled out and accused or intimidated. This is a new issue. Journalists' personal safety and the tranquility to carry out their work is an international recognized standard. I hope we don't need to make recommendations about such obvious characteristics.
I'd like also to add something more, let's say, on practical side. In this document, you could see different sections. So section on voters registration, financial campaign, media, and the different others. So there are very specific cases described there, and also specific recommendations which are, let's say, which is a product and result of our joint work here. Of course, many experts, many people, many experienced people, they were involved in this process. So I think it's worth it to see, and much more better to implement it.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes, please.
So Christian Carl from the Washington Post. I'm very sorry for arriving late, so I'm probably asking you about something you've already addressed. I was wondering what your stance was on the issue of gerrymandering, districting, problems that came up with that, and any specific recommendations for reform. Thank you.
Yes, I know that is not a specific issue in this country, discussion about that subject, but we hope that changes will be made in the sense of this redistricting be made in a non-partisan, motivated way, and in accordance with the census that is coming. that can be a good support for a more fair and more feasible process.
Do you like to add something? Okay. No, in fact, thank you very much. It's a good question. Observer's job to voice, to say, to find something which is important for the process, for the fair process, which is important for the future process. And also when we are coming, we are coming from, now in the United States we are from 30 countries, but OSCE is comprised of 57 countries. So it's also very important to get good practices and to implement it in other countries. So it's one of the main, let's say, desires when we are observing elections in west of Vienna, in the countries that we have more developed democracies, where developed systems traditionally well functioning. But even in the systems, you can find some peculiar issues which could influence process negatively, election process. And one of this is redistricting or gerrymandering, which you could find in our report, and also there are specific recommendations. And I think we are not ending with this. When we are going to the country, then we have also follow-up mechanisms, ODIHR and the Parliamentary Assembly, through our members, through delegations, through specific structures to work on issues that was defined previously and defined as a negative, which should be addressed properly. And also in our recommendations, even today in our report, we underline that specifically, the specific issue that you asked us. Thank you very much again for this question.
Thank you.
Would like to add
Would you
something?
like to add something, please?
The issue of impartiality of the election administration was one which we came up in other issues as well. Though we cannot go beyond in terms of recommendations, those standards to which the United States is party, and it is not a member of the Council of Europe, which does have actually some clear language on the criteria which should be adhered to in the question of redistricting. I think it's safe to say that a long-standing OSCE recommendation is that impartiality and the perceived fairness of the process are important components of the election process, and one which we will continue to advise on adopting.
Thank you. If we have time for one or two more questions, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Yaroslav, TASS News Agency. I would like to ask if you saw any signs of foreign interference into elections. Thank you.
Mr. Saratelli.
That's interesting, spicy question always when it comes to United States, or not. Now it's not only United States. To be frank, we have also, it's in our report. We did not see any evidences of that, not evident cases of that, not confirmed cases. But I don't know. Now technologies are very sophisticated. So what could be discovered after, we don't know. Sometimes answers are coming a little bit late. So we couldn't say there was any interference at this moment we observed. So we are a little bit limited also in time. You understand we're short observers. As I know, the similar response could be also from ODIHR's side. And also it's explained in our document here that we didn't see any evidences of that. Not verified cases of that.
Thank you. One more question, perhaps? If there are no more questions, I suppose we can wrap up. As Mr. Saratelli mentioned, we do have there's a document, our post-election statement of preliminary findings and conclusions. It's outside of the door. and we have, which will also be on our website, osc.org. So please pick one up on your way out, and you'll find a lot of information there that might answer any other questions that you might have. So with that, I would like to thank you all for coming, and thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Hello, I'm sorry. So sorry I was late.
No, no problem. Well, we anticipated a question about Russian observers in U.S. Thank you. We had your colleague at the at our briefing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Hi, sir. Michelle Lee.
Yes.
Yeah, she was very good.
When was that?
It was 2 or 3 days ago. So we had a few briefings here.
Oh, wonderful.
And she was.
She spoke on campaign finance.
Oh, great.